Morning all. So just to let you know, we're waiting for a few more people. So please just give us maybe 2 more minutes and then we can kick off. Thank you.
Thank you.
So once again, good morning. We're waiting for a few more people. I think the number as of Friday was 43. We'll see if we get to like about 32 and then start. That's okay. So just bear with us for a couple more minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think we're nearly there, but I think we're going to start now because we only have 45 minutes. So I just want to say thank you first of all, for everyone joining today for this first, I think, of a series of teaching sessions you have for the Open Networks Ecosystem Competition. So hopefully this presentation will allow us time to go through the subsidy control approach for the competition, which we're going to abbreviate to one from now on, and prevent us having to say that every single time. And it's going to be led by ourselves and the subsidy control team. So that's myself, Darling Doku. I'm one of the heads of the subsidy control team. And we have David Mwunge. So David, you just want to come off mute?
Yeah, morning everyone, morning.
So he's David's a regulatory compliance lead as well within the subsidy control team. And then you have Andy Crump, who's joint head with myself, and he leads the head of the National Competence Centre. And we provide advice and guidance to all of the kind of future networks programs competitions. So from previously 5G trials and testbeds programs to some of our other competitions, from the Frank competition, the Future RAN networks competition, to the One competition. But we also provide advice and guidance to our Building Digital UK projects for all the subsidy control programs and to our devolved administrations for the delivery of broadband as well. So that was just a really brief intro. I'd love to do introductions of every single person on the call, but that would probably take forever. So we're just going to, yes, no, go straight into it. And so Josh as well. So Josh is in the FMP team. He'll be driving the slides for us and taking us through this presentation. It will be myself and David. So David, do you want to start off then? Over to you.
Yep. Next slide, please, Josh. So this is just briefly what we'll be covering today. So obviously the UK Subsidy Control Act, and then we'll go into a bit more detail in the research, development and innovation streamlined route, which we'll be following for the One competition. And Darling will then also explain the assurance requirements, which we'll be following kind of throughout the sort of pre-grant funding agreement process. And next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so this slide is just around the kind of legal context around, so just for a bit of history, really. So we started with state aid law, And then that was replaced by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement kind of during the transition period, just after EU exit. And now we're in the Subsidy Control Act, which came into effect 4th of January this year. So for those of you who are familiar with state aid law, so the RD&I streamlined route is quite similar in some respects to the general block exemption regulations. But yeah, that's just if you kind of do want to do any kind of comparison to anything you've done previously. The links here are all very important. By the way, we'll be sharing the slides. Also, I will not be able to cover everything in this brief little period now, but I'd recommend to everyone to look into the links posted here. Like I said, we'll share the slides afterwards. And so yeah, for context, so some of the schemes which were already in progress before the Subsidy Control Act, they'll kind of be continuing because they were still under state aid rules. And next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so what is a subsidy? So a subsidy is basically a fund paid by the government to economic actors which can distort markets. So two examples of this are subsidies can confer an advantage onto the recipient of a grant that they wouldn't otherwise had, or subsidies can inadvertently assist the recipient to gain a monopoly within their industry or area. Because of this, governments can only give a subsidy when they've identified a market failure. So in the context of one, this is off the back of the Future Telecoms Infrastructure Review, which the DI team published in July 2018. So this highlighted a number of gaps in kind of the telecom space, and one as a program is addressing the need for open and interoperable software and hardware products, as you will be aware, where the market needs support to develop these. But in providing this support, we need to be careful that we're not distorting the market as little as possible. So this is what we call them limbs. So for something to count as a subsidy, it needs to meet all four of those limbs. So I won't go through them all. Like I said, we'll be sharing the slides at the end. But yeah, this is just kind of context for what a subsidy is. And next slide, please, Josh. So the RD&I streamline route, as I mentioned earlier, so although the Subsidy Control Act came into place on the 4th of January, I'm looking to see if I'm getting my dates here right. Darling's not shaking her head, which is good. So the RD&I streamline route came into effect the day after the 5th of January. All the schemes that are subsidies we have to publish on the BAYS, sorry, it's not BAYS anymore, the DBT transparency database. And so, yeah, we need to do this for anything that's kind of been enacted since the 5th of January. So subsidies must fall within the following categories. I'm not going to address category 1 or category 3 because the one program will be falling under category 2. So subsidies for industrial research and experimental development projects. So yeah, that was just a very kind of brief bit of context, and I think I'm passing over to Darling to get into kind of the nitty gritty of the schemes.
Well, thank you very much, David. And also, just to say, there'll be plenty of time for questions. But if anything comes up in relation to the slides that David just went through, I'm happy to take a short little intervention here and discuss any questions that you may have, or happy to just move on and then save questions for the end. I'll take that as save questions for the end. Okay, next slide, please, Josh. So, as David mentioned, we're delivering, and our approach is to comply with the category 2 of the streamlined RD&I route. So this was published legislation, which you can find, which sets out how governments and public authorities can give subsidies for these types of category. And for those of you who are familiar with DCMS, so FMPDI projects previously and now DSIT projects, we've used the same sort of approaches for quite a few of our competitions. So under, as David mentioned, GBA. So this approach will be familiar, hopefully, to those of you who worked under GBA, where the UK has now enacted its own sort of similar legislative route. And the purpose of it is to enable public authorities to be able to give subsidies in a less bureaucratic way, to make it much more like certain, I suppose, for the public authority. So for our purpose, DSIT, that we comply with the legislation, and also to give some certainty to those organisations who are participating in the competitions. So category 2 is, as David mentioned, does cover industrial research and experimental development. From the way the one competition is designed and its approach, it is going to comply and set out in the application guidance and the competition guidance with the experimental development part. And this recognises that certain aspects of it will be closer to the market. So you need sort of less subsidy to remedy the failure, the market failure. So essentially, experimental development is the category which we believe will be able to deliver the outcomes and objectives for what we're trying to achieve under one. So with category 2, and this is all lifted from the legislation and the statutory guidance, and as I said, there will be some links which you can look at and refer to those organisations, refer out as well, so you can also see this, but this is effectively a lift and shift from the guidance. So category 2 is the maximum award for experimental development projects is 3 million per enterprise per project. So, and that's quite key, because we know we get a lot of questions about the funding approach, and we'll go on to the organisations who are not classed as enterprises and what the approach is to that. So just to confirm, it's 3 million per enterprise per project, and not the project as a whole. So if there are multiple enterprises which are collaborating on a project, then the eligible costs are based on their share of the costs, and they are each eligible for the maximum amount. So if you have 2, 3 enterprises, depending on the whole makeup of the consortium and depending on what the total eligible costs are, each enterprise can receive up to 3 million per enterprise for what they're delivering effectively. And this is, as I said, all set out in the legislation very clearly. And so hopefully it'll be quite clear when you start to read that what the case may be. And as you know, for enterprises, some of you may not know, that the legislation sets out what can be achieved if you're a small, medium and large enterprise, or what you can receive. So we call this a subsidy intensity. It's also called the intervention rate, and also called an aid. So I'll respond to your question in a minute, Gary. Thank you. So small enterprise for experimental development can achieve up to 45% of the eligible project costs, medium 35% up to, and large up to 25%. However, if there's collaboration in the consortium, then an additional 15% can be applied. By collaboration, that means more than one organisation working together, and they're sharing the outcomes of the outcomes of the project. So in relation to that, this is where the effective collaboration comes in. So it may be called knowledge dissemination, and that's what we'll be looking for as well to achieve that uplift. And I'll just, before I come to the questions, chapter 14, part 2, chapter 14 of the statutory guidance published by BEIS has all the information needed, with some very useful examples actually on what this looks like and how it can be applied. So it goes through exactly what the scope of that RD and I streamline route category 2 is, sets out the subsidy intensities, sets out what the eligible cost definitions are, and the eligible cost definitions are quite defined in relation to what can be funded by DSIT and then also by the partner organisations, and then also sets up what the limitations to those eligible costs. So it has very clear guidance on depreciation and residual assets, and the purpose of those residual assets not being for commercial purposes, because remember, this is R&D and I. We're not here to fund commercial activity. So if that's okay, I'll move to some of the questions. So first of all, Gary's. So if an enterprise, actually the vendor and operator, would be in more than one consortium, with the 3 main, yeah. So it depends on the, so, okay, let me take it a step back. So under GBA, and as with this, there were rules on accumulation. So where an enterprise is receiving the same subsidy for doing the same things in the project. So essentially, if it's for separate activities and they're not doing the same activity, they're not having the same funding for across projects, then it would be 3 million. If there is an indication that actually some of the costs or some of those activities may be taking place on another project, then the accumulation cap comes in. So it would just need to be very clear that in any case, you're not basically double funding or providing double subsidy for the same costs across projects. And once again, refer to the guidance, expect you to refer to guidance so you're absolutely clear that is the case, because we will be requesting that information throughout our assurance activities, which will come on later. So Ian, but thank you for your question, Gary. Ian, and we'll put these questions in writing as well, if that helps, as part of the CQ process, the clarifications questions process. So Josh, if we just make sure we copy that, because once we leave, those questions will go, but thank you. So Ian, on to you. Is it Ian Groves? Yeah, hello.
Sorry, Michael. Hello. Yes, I just said I had the same question. I mean, if I understand it, one has 3 project categories: HDD, RIC, and hardware. If we want a project in each of those 3 categories with a consortium, are we entitled to up to £3 million as a small enterprise for each of those projects, or is this 3 million a cap for one company on the whole of the one project? Is that clear?
It is clear, and I think it depends on whether the activities you're producing or the cost you're paying for, so what's defined as eligible costs, are separated for that specific project, or there is a consistent thread. So if you're, for the HTD, for example, have eligible costs, and that can be applied to another project or another competition, then essentially that's where the accumulation rules will come in, because we can be funding the same activity across both projects. So it will be, in that case, up to 3 million, because you're effectively doing the same across the whole piece. But this is where I think, Ian, I would suggest that if you're intending to, bid for this proposal, this is where, when we get onto the assurance requirements and seeking that guidance via looking at the accumulation, and whether it applies to the activities you're planning to do for each of those projects, to make it very clear. And we'll talk about how you can assure yourself of that case, and what DCMS or DSIT will need to assure ourselves as well in those circumstances. So I think the answer is it depends, subject to reading the legislation and the guidance.
Okay, thank you.
That's okay. Nice to see you. The other question we had, Karam. So the maximum limit per project is 10 million per project. So it seems we need a minimum of 4 entities in a consortium to reach this target. Is this true? So I think it's the maximum, but you may not need that amount depending on the activities. And remember, it's how you set out your consortium is up to you. However, we've seen with some of the larger, I suppose, funding, that there are 4 or more, I suppose. And you also have to bear in mind, and this will come up in the commercial and finance parts as well, when you have that teaching about the maximum in relation to how the eligible costs are weighted, so not more than 70% per one organisation. So this will need to be borne in mind when you're looking at how you comprise your consortium. So yes, up to, but we're only paying for the eligible costs. So, what's necessary to achieve the objective. And I'll just also be mindful of that as you're putting your proposal together.
No, thank you for clarification. But of course, the limit was announced to be 10 million per project, I think. But if you're a larger organization contributing more than 70% of the overall project, then I don't think so you will be able to go beyond 3 million. Yeah, that's the limit.
Yeah, and to be fair,
then that's why I'm saying my calculation doesn't stack up, that if you are contributing 70%, how can you achieve 10 million then, right?
Without having more than 4 enterprises.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So according to your calculation, that would be right. But and it's just to bear that in mind. And also, when we were looking at the approach, we considered, so using the R&D and I streamline route and not going down another approach, we considered whether, the 3 million per enterprise per project would fit what we wanted to achieve. And based on the history of delivery in this area and with our 5G trials and test beds program, we haven't seen that organizations have needed that maximum, enterprises, I should say, actually have needed that maximum. But as you said, Karam, that comes with more than 4 enterprises in the organization, but also made up with universities and other partners and research knowledge dissemination organizations, which we'll discuss as well. Following question from, oh, sorry, can you please clarify the position of funding charities and sick? Okay, so Peter, I'm going to answer Venkat's question and I'll come to yours because we will discuss that, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Following question from, if we're partners, so sorry, yep. So is this still the case? So I'm not going to address that too much here because that will come up in the commercial and finance teaching, which is happening this week. So please do, like us all, Josh, make a note that we need to make sure that's explicitly addressed by Dale and Lee in their presentations. But yeah, the approach hasn't changed and you'll see that as in the application guidance as well, Venkat.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
No worries. So if we go into the next slide, so we'll go into the next slide and talk about the approach to universities and research knowledge dissemination organisations. I'll address that first and then we can answer your question. So in relation to universities, so first of all, right, as under EU guidance, it was considered that the subsidy control regime as well and research organisations, the approach would say the same and follow. So where universities are not delivering economic activity or maybe it's minimal to what their overall activities are, so they're performing a purely non-economic role, they can still apply as part of this competition for up to 80% of their eligible costs. So and this is recognised as an approach from under, as I said, the EU state aid regulations and the legislation, the Subsidy Control Act and the Streamline Route has sort of followed this approach for consistency and so that organisations are aware of what the approach is. So the universities, I mean, there's a clear carve out. So when looking at the statutory guidance, there's a clear carve out for universities. And also, I think this is quite helpful because it provides everyone a bit of reassurance in regards to where activities may not constitute a subsidy, for example, fundamental research, experimental development, where there is no economic activities taking place. The key thing is, you know, BEIS's guidance. Sorry, I keep saying BEIS, but I'm still trying to get used to the transition. The Department for Business and Trade's guidance is that in all cases, where universities are considering, are they for the purposes of DSIT funding, providing an economic activity, or then qualify as an enterprise, they should always go back through the 4-limb test that David outlined at the beginning to confirm whether this is the case, and it should be applied on a case-by-case scenario. So walk that university through and say, do you meet all those 4 limbs? If not, then you're not an enterprise for the purpose of the Subsidy Control Act, and therefore it's not a subsidy. In the same way, the case would be for research development and research and knowledge dissemination organisations. So it's not the status, so whether they're a charity or a CIC, it's more so the activity they're performing, which is the key consideration. So Peter, in response to your question, walk through that 4-limb test, look at the definition of research knowledge dissemination organisation, which is clearly set out in the statutory guidance. If the activity that you're performing meets the definitions, then the status will be defined as a research dissemination organisation, if that's the case. So it's useful to be able to confirm that you're a charity or a CIC, but for the purposes of the Subsidy Control Act, that's secondary to actually what's the activity which is being performed for the purposes of the DSIT funding for this competition. With public authorities, because some may have public or local authorities, other public bodies, generally speaking, public authorities wouldn't meet, so funding to public authorities wouldn't meet that 4-limb test. So therefore would be discounted as part of, you know, the Subsidy Act, Subsidy Control Act. However, once again, if there's any doubt, suggest you walk through, the legal advisors walk through that 4-limb test to confirm that what the activities of the public authorities are doing wouldn't count as a subsidy. I mean, are there any further questions on this? Because I know, as I said, this is where we'll probably get a bit more of those follow-up questions. But just to let you know, like throughout this process, myself and David and Andy Crump will be are part of the FMP programme for this, and will be responding to any subsidy control questions that may arise via the clarify question process. But then also for those successful bidders, through to assurance and then project delivery as well. So yeah, so public authorities, depending on what the aim is, they can achieve up to 100% for their eligible project costs. I hope that answers your question, Paul Fleming. Gary, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, darling. Just a quick question on that external legal advice around the whole question there on subsidy control. Is that claimable? So if we go to an external legal for advice, that is an acceptable claim?
So for the purposes of the eligible costs, external advice wouldn't be considered eligible costs. So it wouldn't be claimable for the purposes of this. There will be normal costs which will be funded as part of any organisation bidding for a competition. So we've had that question before, but thank you for asking actually, because that's quite useful. And I would say that in relation to the written legal advice that we require, so just going back to these first bullet points, so at proposal when you're bidding, some organisations have chosen, once the consortium is confirmed and once they're submitting their application, to take out legal advice at that stage to confirm that what they're entering into does meet the compliance with the Subsidy Control Act and the streamlined R&D&I route. However, that's not a condition. You don't have to do it at that stage, but you need to confirm that you will get that legal opinion if your bid is successful at the point you are confirmed a winner, and share that with DSIT for the purposes of our compliance and assurance purposes. Now, it doesn't have to be external legal advice. It can be your, if organisations have general counsels, it can be your internal organisation legal advisor or lawyer, but it has to be that written legal opinion and analysis.
So just, if I can just clarify, darling, just for everybody's benefit, not just mine, because this is pre-GFA, so this would be post-bid where we've been told we've been successful. It's at that point you want to see the evidence. So at that point, even though that it's at the point where we've been told we're a winner, that still is not an eligible claim, so we would need to fund that ourselves.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
No worries. So on that other point, I'm just stressing that because it comes up, does it have to be external lawyers? It doesn't have to be external lawyers. It can be your internal lawyers, as long as it comes from your internal lawyers effectively for the purposes of this. And then as we move to the GFA stage, the team, so the subsidy control team. Oh, sorry, Paul, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, darling.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just to clarify. So what I was just checking is, say you had a consortium and a project worth £5 million. Is there, with multiple public sector organisations involved, is there a percentage that would apply to the 5 that, you know, do you have to have, I guess what I'm saying, do you have to have private sector involvement in the overall project?
For the purposes of this, so I think, can I take that away and come back?
Of course, yeah. Because
Yeah.
I think previously there was a threshold around public sector participation in the total consortium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're, yeah, so okay, that's fine. I think, Josh, we can take that one back and come back because yeah, there's been different approaches. Somewhere it's been wholly public sector organisation, and then others where this has been a combination of it. And are you thinking that, Paul, across all 3 strands, or?
It's probably a little bit hypothetical, but
okay.
But yeah, it could be on an individual strand or perhaps across multiple strands. Yeah.
Okay, that's useful. We'll come back to you and provide a response. So yes, sorry. So just going through at GFA stage, no worries, Paul. We'll receive the advice, and that will form part of the kind of GFA as well. So in the grant funding agreement, your legal advice will be appended, and that will form one of the schedules of the GFA as well, in regards to that compliance. But as I said, as part of any of the mobilisation meetings, we'll be here to revisit the subsidy control approach, because we understand that there'll be a lot of other streams in getting you ready for the GFA and getting project delivery. So we like to revisit the subsidy control approach at key stages along the process, just to make sure we're all aligned in regards to the requirements and what's needed. In the past, where needed, we've happily had conversations with general counsels or external law firms to discuss the approach. I think a lot of them are quite well versed in this, but as you know, we're in a new subsidy control world for the moment, using a new streamlined R&D&I route. And so if there's any questions that come up, our team will be ready on hand to help assist. Right, should we go on to the next slide, please? So this is the final slide, or one of the final slides, and it's really just about the kind of useful links that we have. So referenced it already in this teaching. So we've had the clarification questions and responses, and we would advise that you do look at that from time to time in relation to any open questions or questions that are being raised. As I said, we'll seek to publish some of the questions that we've addressed here on that as well, to make sure it's available for anybody who couldn't attend as well. And we've got the streamlined route guidance, and I have these two, so the streamlined route guidance and the streamlined subsidy scheme guidance, pinned to my screen on a daily basis, because you read something once and go back over it again to make sure everything's aligned, but it still does say the same thing. So please do read it and refer it on to those who need to know within your organisations. But this will give you quite a clear view on the approach. And we also have further details. I mean, you'll see other streamlined routes, which is the main link, and that's on energy and so forth, but those aren't useful for our purposes. But once again, these should be the links that you're referring out to when thinking about the subsidy control approach. So actually, we've done that in quite good time, and thank you for your questions. But we are here as well if you have any other questions. And so some people I recognise from previous competitions, so hopefully this won't be too much of a shock for you in relation to what we're saying. You've heard it before. Others, if it doesn't make sense now, it will do as we progress. But let you know that you're not alone, and we are here to support during this process. But at this stage, are there any further questions that you may have? No? Okay, so Josh, just for confirmation, the commercial and finance teaching is on Thursday, is that correct? Yeah.
It's on Wednesday, the 19th.
Wednesday, okay, brilliant. So how do we get in touch with them further questions? Please use the CQ. Would that be the best way, Josh, you think?
It will be, there's also an email address, which is onp.inquiries@gov.uk.
So is that onp.inquiry?
Inquiries, yeah.
.gov.uk. Any others? No? Okay. Well, I'll give you the 12 minutes back. Thank you very much all. Appreciate your time today, and look forward to speaking with some of you soon as well as the competition progresses. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.